Ukrainian national-patriotic forces had fought for solidarity and the independence of Ukraine since 1930s. During World War II, they founded the anti-Hitler resistance movement in the western Ukraine, which was called the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, UPA. Insurgent because its commanders hoped that the belligerent forces would get exhausted during the confrontation and that would give the opportunity to start a national uprising and achieve the independence of Ukraine. They realized that a nationwide uprising was impossible without the preparation for such an insurrection through the organization of partisan war, which had to become an overture to the national uprising. According to Ukrainian researchers of the National Liberation Movement, not all the UPA soldiers shared the nationalist ideology or belonged to Ukrainian nationalist organization. Who were they? First of all, they were cadre revolutionaries who devoted their entire lives to the struggle for Ukrainian independence. They took part in all kinds of underground movements. There were people who fled and hid from being forced to work in Germany.
Були колишніми червоноармійцями оточенцями і пристали, скажімо, до націоналістичного руху, до українського націоналістичного руху.
There were also former Red Army soldiers who joined the Ukrainian nationalist movement. Finally, these were people who were mobilized. So in March of 1943, Ukrainian auxiliary police units deserted subdivisions of the German service. Thus, an army was gradually formed in the underground on the basis of such a heterogeneous element. It turned out that the Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which consisted of roughly 100,000 fighters during its heyday in the summer of 1944, was considerably battered after the end of the war. In addition to the Germans, they had to fight the forces of Polish partisans who wanted to restore Polish statehood in western Ukrainian lands. They also fought the Soviet power in battles with the Soviet partisans in particular. The UPA also destroyed the means of communication of the Red Army and attacked its units that were located further from the front.
І коли фронт в липні-жовтні 44-го пішов далі на захід,
when the front shifted further westward in July-October 1944, it took the UPA several months to regroup. 60% of the units in Volyn were either destroyed or scattered by the frontline troops, the Red Army or the Wehrmacht. The situation in Galicia looked slightly more promising, even though 40% of the troops there were also dispersed or killed. In short, it was very difficult for them to put up resistance to both the frontline units and the partisans. However, the UPA detachments were quickly replenished after the war, because after Hitler's troops were driven out of Ukraine, the party, Soviet and punitive organs continued the so-called socialist transformations that were initiated in 1939 to 1941 and were accompanied by large-scale terror. Then began the forced liquidation of private property, primarily land, the forcing of peasants into collective farms, and hasty industrialization. In such conditions, Ukrainians of the western regions were forced to continue the national liberation struggle against the Soviet power regime. Risking their lives, mainly young people joined the UPA detachments under the motto, "Win the freedom of Ukraine or die for it." In response, the Soviet regime organized the searches of large territories where Ukrainian partisans were concentrated and put up long blockades so they could not escape.
Взимку 45-46 року радянська влада вирішила застосувати тактику.
In the winter of 1945 to 1946, the Soviet government decided to use the tactics of the so-called large blockade.
До весни, аж до сходження снігу, цілковито.
Its essence was to completely block the forest tracts in the winter until the spring, before the snow thawed. The maneuvers on the German front had already ended by then. At the end of 1945, large numbers of troops were withdrawn from Europe to the places of permanent deployment.
Ще не всі були демобілізовані, і приблизно
Not all were mobilized. About 400,000 Red Army soldiers, internal troops, and border guards were involved in the blockade. There is an opinion among historical scholars that roughly 40% of the personnel of the insurgents were destroyed as a result of the large winter blockade of 1946. People either died, they deserted the territories in an attempt to escape, or they had no other choice but to surrender to the enemy. However, the commanders of the UPA did not lose hope that they would manage to start a national uprising on the wave of discontent with the actions of the Soviet authorities. But Stalin understood quite well how to prevent an uprising of the peasants, namely hard labor camps and famine. He weakened Ukraine by introducing the terrible famine in 1946 to 1947. The peasants were easily pacified. In 1947, Stalin reacted to the actions of the insurgents with mass forced deportation of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians suspected of supporting the underground. 1947 was the year of dread. It was a terrible bacchanalia in the context of deportations. Why? Early that year, People's Commissar of Internal Affairs Timofey Strokach assured the Soviet leadership that he was ready to prepare the required number of ranks at any time. That meant full readiness to cleanse the western regions of Ukraine of hostile elements. On September 10, 1947, the USSR Council of Ministers adopted a resolution on the eviction of the families of all UN members and active outlaws arrested and killed in battle from the western regions of the Ukrainian SSR to the remote Soviet provinces of Karaganda, Arkhangelsk, Vologda, Kemerovo, Kirov, Sverdlovsk, Tyumen, Chelyabinsk, and Chita. Referring to this resolution, this meant that the preparation for the largest deportation in the western region began. In early October, an operational headquarters that involved powerful forces of the state security and internal affairs agencies was created. According to estimates of authorities of Soviet history, approximately 500,000 people were killed, captured, and deported. That was basically 8% of the population of the western region of Ukraine, which was killed, ended up in hard labor camps, or was exiled to special settlements. In 1947, the UPA command changed its tactics, dividing large units into smaller ones. Initially, they were made up of no more than 50 combatants. Then they were divided into even smaller groups, which consisted of no more than 10 people. The UPA operated with such groups until 1954. There remained small armed detachments that were organized into a more or less complete system or into several systems, and basically, by that year, the majority of a number of different well-organized actions had already been conducted. They avoided large-scale military confrontations with the Soviet troops, saving their strength for a new war between the Soviet Union and the West. The UPA leadership was of the firm conviction that such a war could break out at any time. The political elite of the UPA also took the international situation into account. That was especially evident during the Korean War, when there was a serious possibility of a large-scale clash between the Soviet Union and the United States from 1953 to 1955. That is, it would have meant the resumption of war. Basically, this came down to a direct military confrontation between the Soviet and American troops at the 37th parallel, particularly in the skies between Soviet and American Air Force pilots. At that time, the underground also hoped that a war would break out. But then, when the Soviet Union produced a large number of nuclear weapons, the possibility of such a direct confrontation with the Americans decreased, which consequently quelled such motivations. When it became clear that a general national uprising was impossible, there would be no new war, and that the Soviet system could not be toppled and defeated by armed forces, there was only one way out: to stand ground to the bitter end. First of all, the Ukrainian insurgents, the most motivated ones and their most passionate core, understood that their task was to keep the flag, which was the banner of the struggle, raised for as long as possible. That is essentially what they did. They also held the structures around the UPA. Other people had their own motivation. Some assumed such an illegal position and realized that it was much better to continue the struggle and stay in safe places, to fight and pose a threat to the enemy, rather than sitting in prison or being executed. Secondly, a lot of people who worked there realized that they had no future in that social structure of the Soviet Union. Therefore, they supported forests. Some had relatives living in the woods. Some fought for their relatives. Some took revenge for all the abuse Ukrainians had been victim to. In other words, Ukrainians had good reasons for their position and were highly motivated. Be that as it may, the UPA leadership was even more motivated and understood its mission perfectly well. The activities of the Ukrainian liberation movement incited a large-scale struggle against it on the party of the Soviet regime. The murder of the leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, Stepan Bandera, by a KGB agent in October 1959 in Munich is a brilliant example. It was necessary for them to kill Stepan Bandera in order to seed discord within the Ukrainian movement and deprive it of the banner. The aim was also to pit different parts of the liberation movement that had disagreements against one another to the point that they would blame each other for the failure of their movement. That was essentially the main objective. For 2 years after the murder of Bandera, who committed it and how remained unknown. While the disputes continued, most of the OUN and UPA members abroad read between the lines. Soviet power structures introduced such insidious activities like physical destruction of UPA commanders with the help of so-called militant agents. Some were blackmailed or were found while visiting their families at night. They could be captured. Then they were recruited either through threats to their lives, persuasion, or other means. Then they were given a task. What kind of task could they have been given? For instance, to spread panic during battle, or they were told that an operation in their camp would begin at 5 a.m. Then they had to be near the commander of the 100, kill him at 5:30 a.m. and shout out to the masses, "The commander is dead," in order to spread panic and disorient the people. In addition, there was a solid intelligence and information state security network in the cities and villages of western Ukraine. It is quite clear that the Soviet power had launched a major campaign for the recruitment of secret agents in large numbers. There were tens of thousands of recruited agents. It was really easy to do. There was a law on the protection of socialist property from August 7, 1932. According to that law, or the law of spikelets, anyone who stole even a nail could be thrown in jail for 10 years. People were caught red-handed for petty theft of state property. Then the authorities offered them a choice. Either they would agree to snitch on others, or they would be put behind bars. Their task was to come in person to the district center and tell who in the village had some visitors during the night, where and who said what, and so on. It was that simple. The internal affairs and state security bodies created special squads that put on the UPA uniform and spread lawlessness. By the early 1950s, there were probably more provocatory UPA squads than the legitimate ones. Explosives and poisonous substances were used against the UPA commanders, and compromising information was planted on the OUN security service. That complex of measures applied by the Soviet punitive organs contributed to the elimination of the OUN underground and finally the Ukrainian Insurgent Army. After the death of the UPA commander Roman Shukhevich in 1950, the national liberation movement began waning, concentrating its effort on propaganda and sabotage. But some squads kept operating until the 1960s. Fighting against the Ukrainian national liberation struggle, the Soviet power was not afraid of its armed resistance because the forces from both sides were incomparable. But the regime was frightened by the ideological struggle of Ukrainians for their independence. The longer the Ukrainian national idea existed, the more people it would be able to attract. Therefore, the Soviet authorities were steadfast in their position that the idea of an independent Ukraine in and of itself, and those who strongly believed in this nationalistic idea, posed a serious threat to Soviet ideology, which is why this threat had to be eliminated as quickly as possible.